Okay, so this is an extremely belated attempt to sort of weasel myself into a discussion between pro-life philosopher and scholar Trent Horn and Life Report host Josh Brahm. Now, if you're not familiar with Life Report, I highly recommend that you check out their channel because I feel like the talk show not only attempts to make a case for the prenatal rights movement, but that it also legitimately dedicates a great deal of time and energy to accurately and fairly depicting both sides of the debate. I feel like the host, Josh, he seems to sincerely want to help us understand one another, and that's crucial. It's absolutely necessary that we know where one another are coming from if we're ever going to have any kind of a productive conversation about abortion. So I'll link their channel in the information bar, and I highly recommend that you check their channel out regardless of your views on the issue at hand. Now, with this being said, in the discussion to which I'm responding, I feel like there were a number of unstated presumptions which should have been questioned to a greater degree. And I also feel like there were a couple points that could have been made that weren't, or a couple of points that were made that shouldn't have been. So I'm going to start with the presumptions, and there's two of these in particular that I think relate to Judith Jarvis Thompson's Violinist thought experiment, which dominated a great deal of time and energy in the upload to which I'm responding. And then there are two assumptions which are made while discussing the issue of abortion versus child support, and a final assumption which is made that's not really related to either of those, but which I think warrants some discussion. So I'll start with the two regarding Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist thought experiment. Now, the first of these assumptions is one that I think is actually intrinsic to the thought experiment itself, and I'm going to provide the full text in the information bar if you're interested in checking that out. I highly recommend it. Hands down, my favorite piece of literature pertaining to abortion. But in the essay, Judith Jarvis Thompson presumes that the obligation you have to your unborn child is synonymous with the obligation that you would have to a complete stranger that you'd never met, were he or she dependent on you in a similar fashion. And I don't think that this is necessarily the case, but I do think it's a presumption that both Trent Horn and Josh tended to adopt while analyzing the essay. So basically, the notion here is that the duty to act is equal in both cases, that your obligation to one individual is synonymous with your obligation to another. But if you've looked at the current law, you're going to find that that's not really the case. For example, I recently took a class certifying me to teach and provide CPR and first aid. And a part of this class was a segment dedicated to legal considerations so that I knew how to avoid lawsuits, and I knew what I was legally obliged to do and what I was legally allowed not to do. And what I found was that if, for example, I were walking down the street and a complete stranger had a heart attack, and I looked over and I saw him, and I realized that the only way for him to survive would be for me to provide some CPR, well, I don't have an obligation to do so. I don't even have to call EMS. I could just walk off. Now, don't get me wrong. That would be a disgusting, horribly immoral thing to do. There would be a special place in hell reserved for me between the pageant moms and Hitler. But I would legally be allowed to do so. That would be, under the current legal system, my right. Now, whether it should be that way or not is a matter of opinion. But there is some room for debate here, and I don't see why you should presume one way or the other without at least making some form of argumentation for why you did so. So that's the first presumption that I think warrants further discussion. The next is this confounding of moral correctness and political permissibility. And I think that this one is just extremely inappropriate in light of the fact that we are discussing Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay, because if you've ever looked at the violinist thought experiment, it's an extremely libertarian approach to the abortion issue. And in the libertarian ideology, political permissibility is not synonymous with moral correctness. And yet I feel like both the host and the guest tended to treat these two terms as though they did in fact mean the same thing, when that's not necessarily the case. Now, there are some who argue that our laws should force us to engage in moral behavior, but I and other libertarians disagree with this notion. In fact, I would argue that it's impossible, because in order for an action to have moral value, it has to be done willingly. You can't force somebody to do something wrong or force somebody to do something right. It's only when you personally, willingly choose a course of action that reflects upon your moral status. But more importantly, I think that the government doesn't necessarily have the jurisdiction that it would need in order to enforce moral behavior. here. So take prostitution, for example. While I think prostitution is immoral, I don't believe the government has any jurisdiction over the sexual or economic conduct of private citizens except to protect other citizens from having their rights violated. So if you've got two consenting adults and one wants to pay the other for some kind of a sexual interaction, I don't believe that the government has the jurisdiction necessary to prevent them from doing so, even if they were to abstain from, even if abstaining from this course of action would be morally better than engaging in this course of action. So no, I don't believe that moral correctness and permissibility are the same thing. There's a distinct difference here that the host and the guest seem not to acknowledge. So those are the primary presumptions that I think were inappropriate during the discussion of Judith Jarvis Thompson's Violinist thought experiment. Now, to move on to the presumptions made while discussing child support and abortion, there were two of these that bothered me. The first one was this notion that the nature of a woman's body matters. Trent said that he points out that women's bodies are specifically designed to provide for the child in the way that they do. And that's true. Only a woman can go through gravidity and protruency, but I don't believe that this is relevant. In fact, I think the notion that the woman's biological design predisposes her to a certain course of action which she is obliged to take is quite antediluvian, and I would encourage Trent to read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, because I think that she provides a pretty good case against this kind of thinking. So, no, I don't like that approach at all. The other assumption is something I think has some more validity, but is superfluous and not necessary, and that's that magnitude matters. And what I mean by that is that Trent argued that the burden of a man may be equal to or greater than the burden of a pregnant woman when it comes to parenthood. And he used a pretty effective example pointing out that surrogates are compensated less than men pay in child support. But I think all of this is completely unnecessary, because the question here isn't the magnitude of the burden, it's whether the burden is due or undue. An undue burden is, by definition, undue regardless of the magnitude. So, for example, it's probably a lesser burden to make me engage in servile labor for 24 hours than it would be to enslave me for the rest of my life. But both of these courses of action are utterly, absolutely, and infinitely unacceptable. There is not some kind of a scale where you gauge this is 50% unacceptable, this is 60%. No, it's just acceptable or unacceptable. And if a burden is undue, then it is unacceptable to force me to take that burden on regardless of the magnitude. So when we're looking at parental rights and responsibilities, we need to ask ourselves, is this due or undue? Not which parent has the bigger burden. And I have another upload where I discuss this in greater depth, so I'll link that in the information bar, and I request that you take a look at it, because I think that it elaborates on this point to a great deal. So those are the two presumptions with regards to the child support debate that I think need further assessment. The final assumption that isn't related to either of these, but that exists throughout the video, is the notion that infants are the moral political equivalent of grown adults. And I definitely believe that this is true, but not everybody will agree. Sisyphus Redeemed, he's a YouTube user with quite a following, has repeatedly argued that infants are inferior, they don't deserve all the same rights as us, and that under at least certain circumstances it's okay to kill them, when in comparable circumstances it wouldn't be okay to kill an adult. So in his eyes, infants are inferior, they're a lesser form of human. And this view has also been championed by pro-choice philosopher Peter Singer, who is a best-selling advocate of infanticide, and has outright stated that babies, newborn children, aren't any more morally significant than a pig. And he said that under at least some circumstances, killing them isn't a sin. It's not something which is wrong at all. In fact, he says sometimes it's a good thing. Whether or not you agree with that is a matter of personal opinion, but that is a perspective that exists. And it can't even be limited to extremists such as these. It can be brought to entire nations. For example, if you look at Canada, not the people, but the laws, you'll find that they're extremely discriminatory against the newborn population. So, for example, in defining infanticide, it states that if a woman, and I'm going to provide the link to these statutes so you can look at this for yourself, but in Canada, if a woman kills her newborn child, then the maximum sentence for this crime will be it's either 4 or 5, I don't remember, but I'll link it in the information bar. So let's say 4. It's a maximum sentence of 4 years with no minimum sentence, which means that if you kill your newborn child, you're not necessarily going to spend any time in prison. And in fact, it's very frequent that women who do kill their newborn children don't spend any time in prison. One recent case involved a woman who received a sentence of 3 years probation, but spent no time behind bars for murdering her child, although she did spend 90 days in prison for illegally disposing of the body. And then there's another case from, I believe, 1998, where a Canadian woman murdered her newborn child and received the terrible, terrible, dreadful sentence of 75 hours community service. And these aren't actually isolated cases. I'll provide a link to an article which provides a few other examples of this kind of thing taking place in Canada. And the reason that this happens is because, again, under Canadian law, there is no minimum sentence for murdering a newborn child if you are that child's mother, and the maximum sentence is either 4 or 5 years. Now, if you look at other forms of lesser homicide in Canadian law, you'll find that the penalties are much stricter. So, for example, in Canada, manslaughter is a lesser form of homicide where you kill somebody while under extreme duress or provocation. So let's say that one day I'm placed under extreme duress or provocation and driven to shoot another individual. The minimum sentence is 4 years in prison. The maximum sentence is life. So you can see that the penalty here is much, much stricter. And thus we can tell that under Canadian law, infants are in fact seen as inferior. They're not given the same legal protection as a grown adult. And while I think that this is disgusting, I think that it's abhorrent, I think it's antediluvian, I think it's backwards, I think it's more appropriate of a Cro-Magnon during the Ice Age or a Neanderthal during that same period of time than it is of a modern enlightened individual. That is the law of a nation. It is a prevalent disposition which should be addressed. And we can't just presume that it's wrong without discussing that to a greater degree. With all of that being said, I do feel that this dialogue was very insightful, especially when there were references to other philosophers. The baby in the box analogy was particularly interesting. I'd never heard that, but I really do like it, and I might do a video about that in the future. I learned a lot, and thank you for the content. Please keep it up, and I hope that you can get back to me on these comments and criticisms. So thank you very much for your time.